So I'd like to talk about two important ways that Beijing influences America. And I think it's useful to distinguish between how Beijing plays this game and how Moscow does. So Moscow, it's a lot more about chaos for chaos's sake. China, it's a lot more about China. It's a lot more about changing the way Americans think about and interact with China. On the one hand, you'd think, oh, that's less important. It's not about changing the way they do things in America. It's about changing the way they think about China. But it never just stays in the China field. It always bleeds into other aspects. And as part of the book I'm doing, I've been looking at various individuals and institutions and their relationships with China over the last couple decades. And it's fascinating to see how, sort of like that old cliche about Vegas, it just doesn't stay in that little field. It has really grand and in some cases quite worrying influences. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here about that, but I think a good way to think about what Beijing does is to distinguish it, to put it into two different categories. It's about amplifying positive voices and suppressing negative voices. So the amplifying positive voices is about finding Americans who can be encouraged or co-opted, or in some cases outright bought out, who are willing to express views that the party appreciates. And there's certain phrases that you hear being repeated a lot. I'm going to go into some of these phrases. It's important not to hear someone say one of these things and think, aha, spy. It's a very, very blurred line. There's a lot of gradations of this. But Beijing loves to describe itself as this country that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That's a phrase that the party loves to say. And yes, it's true, but it's also this received wisdom that makes it feel like the party is the one that's responsible for the growth in China, as opposed to unleashing the entrepreneurial spirit of Chinese people. There's talk about win-win. There's talk about the camaraderie with Taiwan. There's talk about ethnic harmony. There's this knee-jerk response whenever someone brings up the concentration camps in Xinjiang in northwest China, where there's roughly 1 million Muslims in concentration camps. People will sometimes say, oh yeah, but America had slavery, or America did this, or America did that. Oh, and actually this is America's fault because of the global war on terror. Now, no one who you should be listening to denies that America has not committed a lot of really awful things, past, present, and unfortunately future. But just putting two things next to each other doesn't mean that they're equal. Just because America has committed crimes in the past doesn't mean that we shouldn't very forthrightly call out the abuses that we see in some parts of China today. So, and I lived in Beijing for about 6 years, and it was sort of interesting after I left to see the times when I was being groomed to be a friend of China, or a China hand, or an old Beijing is what they love to say. Just there's certain things that people will say to you, and you learn how to speak this kind of coded language where you say, oh yeah, China is developing very quickly, and yes, along with that development comes these problems like the pollution problem and the corruption problem and the traffic problem. And oh yeah, I guess we can mention Taiwan, but it's sensitive, but I'm actually speaking very, very openly because I'm actually talking about Taiwan. And so it changes the way that your brain works. It's actually, I don't want to use the phrase brainwashing, so I won't, but it gives you this model, this already built model that has been sanded over decades to how you should speak about China. And you have this sense of where these red lines are, and it doesn't actually allow you to have your own truth. And I think this is actually far more worrying and far more pernicious for Chinese Americans, some of whom have family in China, so are worried about that, some of whom face accusations of racism on both sides or of being traitors to their race. And one of the things that I would love to do with the research that I'm doing and the book that I'm doing is to give us and to give Chinese Americans their own ability to have a democratic debate about what we want to do about China's rise. So we are at a really important point in history. It could be that China soon becomes a country that has more ability to exert pressure internationally and domestically than America? And do we want to live in a world where China is the world's most powerful country? If not, can we do anything about it? And is what we would have to do worth the ethical sacrifices? These are really, really difficult questions. I don't have good answers to any of them, but what I think is really important is how do we, as a country, have this debate democratically so that we can decide, use the best information we can, and figure out what kind of world we want to live in.